Welcome to the final video in our series on skepticism. In this video, we're going to talk about the sources of skepticism and what is assumed in each of them. So let's go back to the handout and remember, these are more deeply rooted sources of skepticism. It says skepticism or intellectual despair is rooted in our uncritically held assumptions. So part of a logic class is to help us to recognize assumptions. Those are things that we believe and hold to without much awareness. And so what we're going to look at here are a list of epistemological assumptions. So remember, epistemology is that area of philosophy that asks the question, how do we know? It's the ground upon which our basic beliefs rest. And usually we haven't really thought much about it. We've assumed it uncritically. So we want to be critical thinkers, not uncritical thinkers. So we can start to think now about alternatives to the use of reason and how these alternatives to the use of reason lead to skepticism. So we're going to find out that using reason leads us to knowledge. These are epistemological methods that don't ever lead us to knowledge. They lead us to something else, skepticism, non-knowledge. All right, now there are 6 sources of skepticism, and they each have a different assumption. So in class, I ask, what are the 6 sources of skepticism and what is assumed in each? So you should those are the objectives from this video. What are the 6 sources of skepticism and what is assumed in each? So here's the first source of skepticism, informal fallacies. Now we're going to spend less time on this one because I have a whole series next topic is informal fallacies. So we'll go over the informal fallacies next time. But these informal fallacies involve the use of irrelevant appeals as a substitute for reason and logical argument. And there are a list of examples here. If you're looking at the Peter Kraft book, I think he has 52 different informal fallacies listed. We'll go over the 12 most popular ones. But here are a few: ad hominem, speaking against the person; straw man, arguing against a misrepresentation; begging the question or arguing in a circle; appeal to pity, appeal to fear, appeal to popularity. So we'll go over these next time. But what do they all assume? Informal fallacies assume that if pseudo-argument or fake argument doesn't succeed, then no argument will succeed. I tend to think these are this is the fallback position of people who really like to get into arguments. These are nasty. If you go on comment sections of blog posts or Twitter feeds, sometimes you'll see these informal fallacies being used. I like to challenge students to make a list of them. Whenever you see them, write them down and share them with me because I really like to see the funny ones. So pseudo-argument is a fake argument. So here's how informal fallacies lead us to skepticism. We think we're involved in an argument or a discussion with somebody. Either we or the other person use an informal fallacy instead of a real argument, and we get frustrated because it doesn't lead us to knowledge, and we think, ugh, I tried arguing with people, I didn't get any knowledge, it's pointless, it's hopeless, right? Arguing with people is hopeless. Well, guess what? That wasn't an argument, that was a pseudo-argument, a fake argument. So we need to back up and see, did I use a fake argument? Did someone else get by using a fake argument in our discussion? So if we can name them, they won't have power over us. We can just say, I'm sorry, that's a straw man argument. It's not a real argument. All right, so we'll talk more about the informal fallacies, but what you need to know for this portion is that they assume that if pseudo-argument doesn't succeed, no argument will succeed. Okay, and that's just not true. Real arguments do succeed, or can succeed if we're willing to use reason. All right, the second source of skepticism is tradition and custom. How did you get your basic belief? Where did it come from? Not by experience, because we use our basic beliefs to interpret our experience. We're born into a belief system. Usually it comes through tradition and custom. You're born into a family and a family raises you in a certain way. You're born into a culture and a culture assumes certain beliefs. You're born into a civilization. So usually we get our basic beliefs through tradition and custom. Now that's fine, but the problem is when we trust our tradition as a source of knowledge and it doesn't deliver knowledge, we could fall into skepticism. So tradition assumes what we are most comfortable with is true. So tradition assumes truth is comfortable. Truth is comfort. Here are some examples. Since it's been around for a long time, it must be true. It's right because that's the way I've been taught. Most people I know think and act this way. Now, that's how we come into our basic belief is through tradition, but to stay there is going to be problematic because when we meet people with other traditions, we find out they have different beliefs than we do. So our certainty about our basic belief and our tradition will melt in our exposure to other cultures, or it'll harden into prejudice and we'll say, oh, those people. This is an undesirable outcome and is going to lead us to skepticism. Nobody can really know. There are so many views, right? So don't rely on tradition and custom as a source of knowledge. It doesn't deliver knowledge. It delivers tradition. And tradition can be either true or false. We have to use reason to test the traditions, okay? So come, let's reason together. All right, common sense is a position in philosophy. Sometimes it's called naive realism. So common sense assumes appearance is reality. Now let's think about this. Do you think that the earth, hang on. Do you think the earth is flat? I'm laughing because there are some flat earthers now. I used to joke around this topic and tell students that I thought the earth was flat because I've never seen anything other than flatness, but apparently this is a thing now, so I can't joke about it. But do you think the earth is flat? It appears flat. People thought it was flat in the past. I guess people still do. But no, the earth is not flat. So it appeared flat. It turns out it isn't flat. And then, oh no, skepticism, right? Does the sun rise in the east? Does it? Does the sun rise at all? Well, at one point, people thought that the earth was at the center of the universe and everything was revolving around the earth. Then we found out, oh no, the earth is revolving around the sun. We went from a geocentric to a heliocentric view of the solar system. And this rocked people's worlds, right? And so they went into skepticism. Oh no, we really can't know. Well, did you trust your senses and your senses deceived you? Maybe you shouldn't trust your senses. So common sense takes the condition of the perceiver for granted. What color is the ocean? It depends on where you are, right? It depends on your perception. Now, common sense may work within a small community, like maybe in the Shire where the hobbits live and they share a common view of the world. But once you leave that Shire, things aren't what they seem, right? Common sense doesn't work in the world of science anymore. Appearance is not reality. We don't know what quarks are and gluons are and microscopic things are with just our eyes, right? We need to use tools and we find out, wow, that's not what we thought we would see. So common sense assumes appearance is reality, or it assumes naive realism. Naive realism is a philosophical response to idealism. Idealism says that appearance is illusion. What appears to us is not real. And a common sense philosopher kicked a rock and said, I refute thee thus. This is real because when I kick it, it hurts. That's called naive realism. We want to argue that the material world exists, not just assume it. And there are a lot of people that just assume it. So that leads to skepticism. It leads to like this. The table is real because here it is. And then someone who is an idealist can say, no, it's not. And then we're stuck saying, yes, it is. And notice we don't have knowledge now. So common sense does not lead to knowledge. So we have to go somewhere else to get knowledge. All right, the next one, 4, is intuition. Intuition is that gut feeling that we have that tells us something. Now, my intuition doesn't work very well, so I don't really get that gut feeling, but people tell me about it. Now, intuition assumes that the natural sign is always accompanied by the reality, or the sign is the reality. So intuition is this tool that we have for reading signs, like a smile. What does a smile mean? Friendliness? Not always. I could be thinking evil thoughts and smiling, right? So the sign and the reality could be different. But intuition tells us the sign is accompanied by the reality. So truth and beauty, they don't always go together, but we want them to, right? We want the beautiful people in Hollywood to be good people speaking the truth. Pleasure and goodness don't always go together. Oh, but look at that beautiful chocolate cake. Shouldn't it be good? Shouldn't it taste so good? Shouldn't it be good? No, it's probably going to kill you, right? So pleasure and goodness don't always go together. Sex and love don't always go together. Sex is a sign of the reality of love, but we separate sign and reality. And our intuition says they should go together, and then we get a broken heart, right? So what's the problem with this is that our gut tells us something, but our gut could be mistaken. And so when we rely on our gut to give us knowledge and it doesn't deliver knowledge, then we think, oh, I can't really know. No, don't rely on your intuition. Intuition assumes this is a morally ideal world. And there are some people, artists, people who are more tuned. They have highly tuned intuition. If you watch some of these detective shows like Sherlock, he has very good intuition. He can read all the signs in the room that tell him who the bad guy is, right? There's also a show called Psych. And this guy pretends he's a psychic detective, but that show helps you because when you see the clues he's looking at, it makes a little ching noise, and then he reads it really quickly, and he says, "You're the bad guy," and sometimes he's wrong, right? So his intuition fails him. So the people who have good intuition, we'll call it, are sometimes the artist types. We'll call them the romantic idealists, and the romantic idealists want the world to be the morally ideal world. They want it to be perfect, but it's not perfect. And then they write really good poetry about it, right? They're often sad because the world isn't perfect. So what we can do is say, yes, it's true, it's not the morally ideal world, and you can't have the ideal quickly, but you can have the ideal gradually. So we'll talk about rugged, gradual idealism, that the ideal can be brought about through hard work, through engaging your mind, and over time. It's going to take work. Do you know how much work it's taking to make these videos? I have to remind myself, rugged, gradual idealism, making these videos. Okay, so that's intuition. It assumes that the sign is accompanied by the reality, or the sign is the reality. Sign is sign, reality is reality. They don't always go together. So let's not get stuck in skepticism. Okay, science. Science is a big one here. I'm just going to sketch this one out. This is really important in our day and age because science is seen as the authority in our day. Now, science is being misused and becomes a source of skepticism when its methods are overextended to a philosophical principle. So let's imagine our house. Science is a method. We talk about the scientific method. It includes having a problem and a hypothesis about how to solve the problem, and making some observations and testing data and seeing if your hypothesis stands up after you've used it and tested it, and maybe your test can be reproduced by others. That's the scientific method. But science as a source of skepticism is something else. It's called scientism. It's when science becomes a totalizing worldview. So when we start at the bottom of our house, that bottom position, the epistemology of science as a source of skepticism, is empiricism. All of our knowledge is through the senses. So when empiricism is assumed, then it becomes a source of skepticism. Why? Because all of our knowledge has to be through our senses. There are some things that are definitely left out. So when we say all we can know is through our senses, then what becomes of the foundation? All that our senses deliver is material stuff, matter. So we make the next move, all that exists is matter. And matter is in motion, and matter is constantly changing, and here we are stuck with the skepticism that Socrates was encountering. So, empiricism is always going to lead to skepticism, and I will argue that to my grave. All right, point 2. Science becomes a source of skepticism when it goes beyond its empirical boundary, what we can observe, and it assumes only natural or material forces must be used to explain phenomena. That's the foundation. So scientism assumes all that exists is matter, and matter is eternal. So that's a philosophical claim. That's not a scientific claim, and you can't use science to prove that claim. You have to use philosophy. And point 3, science becomes a source of skepticism when it fails to distinguish data, which is the stuff that comes in through our senses, from fact, which is that stuff that gets interpreted in light of our assumptions. So we're drawing the house now of science. All that data is the sense data that comes in through our epistemology, our metaphysics, and gets interpreted in light of that. So calling it a fact that there is no God, or calling it a fact that there is no soul, that's not a fact. That's an interpretation in light of the assumption of material monism. And we can test those assumptions. All right, point 4. Science becomes a source of skepticism when it fails to notice that it does and must have these philosophical foundations, and we must critically analyze these philosophical foundations for coherence of meaning. What does it mean to say matter is all that exists, that it is the only thing that exists, and that it is eternal? We can test that. We can test that through reason, not through experience. There's no way to experience, to test whether matter is eternal through experience. We are temporal beings. We can't experience eternal. Okay, point 5. Science becomes a source of skepticism when skeptical disclaimers such as tentativeness and pragmatism are used to forego philosophical criticisms of its assumptions. So tentativeness is like saying, give us more time and we'll figure it out. We can say that thinking is in the brain, consciousness is an epiphenomenon of neural impulses in the brain. Give us 10 more years and we'll show you how. We're going to talk about that. Is that true that thinking is a byproduct of the brain? Or is thinking in a different category? And pragmatism is the view that it works. Science gives you cures for diseases and technology, and this works. It makes life more comfortable. Why would you question science? Right? So these tentativeness and pragmatism are used to avoid talking about the philosophical assumptions of scientism, the empiricism and the materialism that always lead to skepticism. So science could become a source of skepticism and has in our day, and we need to question those assumptions. Okay, point 6, and this is the last one. Reason. What? Reason can become a source of skepticism when? Reason is a source of skepticism when it is misused or it is not fully used, and the history of philosophy is filled with the misuse or not being fully used, a reason not being fully used. So let's talk about that. Reason is misused when it's used as a source of truth rather than as a test for meaning. So in the history of philosophy, the rationalists were philosophers who wanted to use reason to find truth. They were looking for truth prior to testing things for meaning. Remember, meaning is prior to truth. Reason doesn't get you directly to truth. It gets you to meaning and then maybe to truth after that. So concepts are either meaningful or lack meaning. Judgments are true or false. So whenever we make a judgment, we should ask, what does that mean? One of these rationalists was Plato, and he said, matter is eternal and spirit is eternal. And he thought that was true, but he didn't ever show us why it was true. And in the name of reason, this claim is unchallenged, and then people say, well, look at where reason leads you. It leads you to Plato's system. Well, that wasn't the proper use of reason. That was a misuse of reason. Now, secondly, reason is not fully used when it's used constructively only and not first and fundamentally used critically to examine basic assumptions for coherence of meaning. Okay, we apply this to Plato again. When we assume the foundation of the house and then we construct the structure of the house, that is using reason, making sure there are no contradictions in the system of belief. But constructive use of reason, just because a system is coherent, doesn't mean that the foundation upon which that belief rests is established by reason. So Plato did build a whole world and life view on his assumption of dualism, but he never properly proved dualism is true according to reality using reason properly. So let's review these two. Reason is a source of skepticism when it is misused or not fully used. It's misused when it's used as a source of truth rather than as a test for meaning. I just thought of another example of this one. The Declaration of Independence begins, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights." So we hold these truths to be self-evident. They're self-evident truths of reason, that all men are created and they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. So these are things that are assumed on the basis of reason, in the name of reason, but it seems like they should be proven. Is it self-evident to reason that there is a God, or is that something that reason should prove? Not everyone believes in God. There are people who doubt, which would tell you it's not a self-evident truth. Self-evident means it cannot be doubted, like A is A. So it's misused when it's used as a source of truth rather than as a test for meaning, and it is not fully used when it's used constructively only and not first and fundamentally used critically to examine basic assumptions for coherence of meaning. So at the end of this handout, notice these are exam questions. These are the questions you should be able to answer at the end of this series on skepticism. What's the difference between a skeptical stance and skepticism? You should also be able to define agnosticism and fideism. What are the responses to there are so many views? What are the responses to it doesn't matter which view you hold? The responses to who's to say which view is right? The responses to it's all a matter of interpretation. The responses to it's all relative. And then what are the 6 sources of skepticism and what is assumed in each? And that's what we went over in this video. So this is the last in the series on skepticism. Hopefully we have gained confidence and competence in our use of reason. We've critically analyzed some of the sources of skepticism and some of the popular skeptical claims. We now should be in a position to see what is knowledge and how is knowledge possible. Before we do that, though, there's one more piece we need to cover, and that's the informal fallacies. So we'll do informal fallacies and then what is knowledge. This is getting exciting, isn't it?